Hey, it's Liam and Carl here from PresentationExpressions.com. We're going to talk about a seminar that we attended and the presentation that we witnessed. And we're going to talk about how we felt the presentation went and how it could have been better. So Liam's going to first of all talk about what the presentation was.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Well, the presentation, the gentleman who was presenting, he gave us some background on the industry that he was talking about. And also, he gave us some advice on entry into that particular industry and also the dangers that we could encounter if we entered the industry as well.
Right. Honestly, it was going to be a pretty good presentation in terms of what you just mentioned there, but it kind of went downhill after that, didn't it?
Unfortunately, it did, and as you said, I was actually quite excited about the presentation beforehand. I was really eager to get in there and listen to this gentleman because he's very knowledgeable, actually, isn't he? That's the thing.
Yeah, that was the things that I actually really wanted to learn what he was going to talk about, but after about 5 minutes, I became so bored. So, what did you think was one of the big problems with the presentation?
Well, one of the things that struck me, and I know it also struck you, this one, Carl, was the situation involving the room itself.
Right, the room itself was, you guys, I mean, it was so dark. It was mid-afternoon that the presentation was being held. It was in a large ballroom, conference room style room. There was probably enough room for over 100 people there, would you say?
Definitely, yes.
Right,
Yeah.
so pretty big, and there was a big stage that he was on, and a big screen that the presentation was being shown on, but they had the lights down to almost like a theater level. I mean, you worked in a theater. Was it as dark as a theater, would you say?
It was. I almost expected Phantom of the Opera to come onto the stage.
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking David Hasselhoff would come up and start singing or something.
That would have been bad.
That would have been really bad. That would have been worse than the presentation, possibly.
Yeah, sorry, David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, sorry, David Hasselhoff. Anyway, so the room was so dark, so it really made the environment, I would think, just subdued, so you weren't that interested because it was so dark.
That's right, and and I remember looking around during the presentation, Carl, and the expressions on people's faces, which I could barely see because it was quite dark, of course, was not good. People were doing the typical things, checking their phones and doodling on pieces of paper and so on. And I've got to confess, I looked at my phone.
Right, I think that wasn't only because I was sending you messages about the presentation, but but anyway, so that was one of the problems. Now, what was something else you noticed?
Well, the other thing that really struck me were the slides themselves, Carl. He actually used his background color on his slides, I believe, was either an extremely dark gray or actually black. I'm not quite sure, to be honest, because of the lighting in the room.
Right.
But that was one of the things that struck me. The slides being in a dark room as well didn't really help. And the other things about the slides really were he was using beveled boxes, to contain certain areas of text.
In various colors, I might add.
That's right, in various colors. And also there was an inconsistency between his slides.
Right. It looked like each slide was created just individually for that particular information that he wanted to give, but it wasn't joined as a whole. There wasn't any kind of flow between the entire presentation.
That's right. And, as we've already mentioned, the subject matter itself was actually a very interesting subject matter, but unfortunately, a combination of things just pulled this presentation down. And, what he could have done, I guess, he did actually start the presentation with a kind of signposting. He did tell us what he was going to talk about. I do recall that. But for me, there were too many things. There was too many individual areas of content.
Right.
I believe there were about 7 or maybe even 9. I can't recall now.
Possibly. But what I also remember was that there was so much content and information on the slides themselves. Now, he was speaking in Korean, and the slides were all in English.
Yes.
And even though there was a direct translation, a simultaneous translation into English for what he was saying, everything was already on the slides. So we really didn't need to listen to him or the translation.
That's correct.
Right,
Yeah.
the amount of information that was in addition to what was already on the slides was quite minimal, I thought. It didn't really, sort of add to what he was already including, and so each slide had full of information and text and huge long sentences and just god awful graphics as well.
No, absolutely. And although you and I both had very little, if not zero, knowledge of the subject before entering the seminar itself, Carl, I can't remember who out of us said this, whether it was me or you, but I remember one of us kind of jokingly saying, I could have gone up and done the presentation much better than him, even though I didn't know the subject, because everything was on the slide, as you said.
Right, exactly. So as far as so we've sort of talked about what was wrong with the room, what was wrong with the slides, the presentation. Also, he stood behind the lectern the entire time.
I know, and I think that was a big mistake, considering he had a stage. I know everybody, when they present, they don't always have the great facilities, of course. But this gentleman, he had the facilities there. He had a nice sized stage that he could have used the length of or the width of. He didn't have to stay behind that lectern.
Right, exactly. So those were the problems that we noticed. So what could he have done better? Let's help people, and in case someone else is going to enter this kind of situation, let's help them with understanding how they could have done this kind of presentation better.
Sure. Well, why don't we go in the same order that we did before? So let's look at the room first.
Okay.
So what could he have done better with the room? Well, for one, I think it could have been lit better. Obviously.
I mean, just turning on the lights would have been better.
Right, and I think for whatever reason, I believe this has come, whether it's from tradition or just pure habit. Whenever somebody does a presentation, so many people feel like they have to turn the lights right down in the room.
Right.
Don't they? But I think the projectors that project the image of the presentation now are much better than they used to be.
Yes, I mean, that could have been one of the problems. And I know that, for example, in those TED Talks, they do have the lights down for the audience, but the stage is really well lit.
Exactly.
So I think if you had taken that type of approach, where if you do have to turn down the lights because the projector can't properly project your images onto the slides, at least get the stage really, really brightly lit, like you were watching a stage production.
That's right, because otherwise you do feel sleepy. It does make you feel sleepy, right?
Right, exactly. Okay, so that was the way that the room looked and the setup of the room. So what about in terms of the slides?
Well, the slides, where do we start, unfortunately, Carl? I think, number one, the presentation itself was too long, for one. I thought the length of the presentation was too much. He could have taken a couple of breaks, possibly. But let's get back to the slides, which was the original question. I think consistency. That would be my first thing. There has to be consistency in your slides.
Sure, and like you said earlier about how the room was going to be dark, and he used a very dark slide, which is not a problem, but if he had made the text maybe brighter or used larger text and removed a lot of what he had placed onto the slides to make the slides clear, with just 1 point, or even just, up to a maximum of 3 points maybe, then we could have, probably enjoyed the presentation more. Also, everything was presented on the slides for everyone to see immediately. There was no clicking and advancing of the information that was being presented even on the individual slides.
That's right. So you found yourself reading ahead anyway.
Right, exactly. So if you just hidden everything and just revealed it as he was going to talk about it, that would have made that part of the presentation better. Aside from the actual design, which we can't really show here, but everyone knows how we feel about design. So what about the delivery of the presentation?
The delivery, well, it was obviously scripted. We could see he had a script in front of him at the time, Carl. And scripts, I do understand why people have them. But personally, I don't like scripts personally. I like to just use maybe my keywords, my key phrases. And after all, if you've practiced your presentation enough, the need for a script is greatly reduced.
Right, and this man was someone who was very knowledgeable. He's a top expert in his field
Right.
in this particular industry. And so to read from a script really, I don't think was necessary. I don't know if it was nerves, if it was because the content on the slide was, was all in English and he was speaking in Korean. That could have been why he was reading from the script. But at the same time, he should be quite knowledgeable in the subject. And like you said, if he had practiced enough ahead of time, he probably really didn't need a script and could have better engaged the audience because he really was looking at the slides as well. He was looking at the English slides.
That's right.
That's
yes,
right. And he was using a laser pointer. That's right. We forgot about the laser pointer.
That's right. We thought we were in a sci-fi film, didn't we?
That's right. I thought I was at the planetarium or something. So, so he was using a laser pointer and pointed things on the slide while he was looking at the slides and standing behind a lectern and reading from a script. So, a combination of very, very bad presentation habits.
And I just want to point out another thing there, Carl, because his presentation, I believe, was scheduled for 1 hour, if I recall,
Right.
looking back at the timetable for the seminar itself. And if you recall, he went over 1 hour.
That's right. That's right. And yes, that's right. That's
And
right.
then, but up until that point, because somebody stepped up to the lectern and basically told him to hurry up.
Right.
But up until that point, he'd gone through every word, every phrase, every number on every slide.
Right.
And then when he was told to hurry up, of course, he went through the remaining slides so quickly. It was crazy.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And I think that took away, really, it took away the expertise that he had. It took away, it made his presentation look even worse.
Right, and I think what he could have done is he could have picked out what were the absolute most essential things from his subject matter, from his presentation, and only presented on those things. And instead of just telling us the facts and the figures and the warnings and everything we could have actually read ourselves if we had done some research, he should have talked about maybe case studies or experiences of other people or his own personal experience with helping people with this industry or getting into this industry and relaying that experience to us and saying, this is what people have done and this is what they could have done better and this is what you should do. That would have been a lot more educational and a lot more interesting, and also it would have conveyed his expertise in the subject matter a lot better.
I agree. So he could have, as we repeatedly say on the site, Carl, he could have told us a story to connect with the audience. And also, the detailed information he could have given as a handout at the end of the presentation. Because actually, in that seminar, there were maybe a little under 100 people, which might seem like a lot. But because of the scale of the seminar and the event itself, I don't believe just under 100 people is too many to give handouts to.
No, absolutely not, especially because this was intended for a global audience and people from different countries were there, and not only locals but different people from different countries were there. So it should have been possible to provide handouts, or at least a way to get handouts if necessary. So let's wrap it up here and just kind of say that, first of all, we want to say that it's not his fault, really, because I don't think he was really well educated maybe in how to give a presentation. So we're not saying that this is a criticism of him directly, but in general, what could go wrong in a presentation if you don't know what to do or are not sure what you could do.
Exactly, and also I'd like to point out, it doesn't matter what your subject is. If you're prepared correctly, whether it be the room itself, the technical equipment, the slides, the practice, it doesn't matter what your presentation is about, it can always be interesting.